Continuing with the betrayal lecture, last of the series we talked about the two Palestinian families, the Husseinis and the Nashashibis, and if you recall, we mentioned that the Nashashibis were willing to cooperate with British, and of course the British relied on them. And then the other thing the British wanted to do was to get the Husseinis to also cooperate, but the Husseinis refused to cooperate, and in fact they became very anti-British. Now keep in mind that in this western island we call the Greater Syria, what is happening there is that the people of the area, especially in the urban centers, are becoming politically participant. And as a result, it's going to be much more difficult for the British to maintain their control. And in the meantime, in parts of that western island, especially the area that was Palestine, Arab landowners, many of whom were really absentee landowners living in Beirut, Lebanon, they begin to sell their lands and their villages to the Jews in Palestine. And from the perspective of the villagers and the Arab, the indigenous population, they see that their livelihood is being gone by the sale of these villages, and therefore they're being sold to foreigners. In response, the villagers start a campaign of terror. So if you ask yourself who are the targets of this terror, mostly really the targets were the absentee landowners, and most of this is happening, most of these people are living in Lebanon, and the landlords were being assassinated even in Beirut. So what happens is that they decide that they better pack up and go, and many of them left for Paris, the safety of Paris. In 1929 and again in 1936, we really have Arab uprising in response to the increased Jewish migration into Palestine and the sales of land to the Jews. As I mentioned, the primary target of the Arab uprising are the Arab landlords, but then the secondary targets are the Jews buying up the land. So Arabs end up going into World War II with the hope of being liberated from the British, because this is the British are really their main tormentor, and their hope is that the British would get defeated. So what is happening is that the most patriotic Arabs, they allied themselves with the enemies of the British, and in this case it's going to be, of course, the Germans. And as I said, there's been charges that the Arabs are pro-Nazi. It had really nothing to do with ideology. It has everything to do with realpolitics, with power, and with the British being the imperial power. So what we have is, with the beginning of World War II, there is an alliance or a de facto wish on the part of the Arabs in the hope that the British will be defeated. So initially what we have is that it looks like the Germans are going to succeed, but what happens is that this is not going to materialize by the end of the war. The British end up defeating the Germans, and of course with that you have essentially a situation in which the Palestinians and the Arabs feel their hopes are not being realized. After World War II, there are two plans that are emerging for Palestine. And these two plans are, as you will see, one calls for the partition of the Palestine, which was something the Jews wanted, and the other calls for the binational single state for both Arabs and Jews. Now, there is a lot of debates going on in the UN, and in the essence of these debates, I'm trying to capture those by showing you two quotes, one from a representative of Arab nationalism and the other from representative of Jewish Zionism. Both, in a sense, are clearly a nationalist movement, one for the Arabs and one for the Jews. So the essence of these quotes, these debates are captured by these quotes, and really the question there is not one of who is right and who is wrong, as you will see, but much more the question of which one would be a lesser injustice when you weigh the Arabs against the Jews. So the first quote defining the lesser injustice, if you like, is the following. It says, "No room can be made in Palestine for a second nation except by dislodging or exterminating the first." In other words, some kind of an ethnic cleansing at the minimum. This was the statement made by the great Arab scholar Albert Hourani. He was a historian and an intellectual and a great thinker. In fact, he wrote a book, a classic tome called The History of the Arab People. So that's one perspective. That's the Arab perspective, trying to explain to the rest of the world in the UN that really you can't create this division in the land of Palestine without causing much harm. The other quote is, in a sense, a paraphrasing of, or someone else quoting Chaim Weizmann, who at the time was the head of the World Zionist Organization. And as you will see, this one was stating that basically the issue is not one of right and wrong, but between greater and lesser justice. Injustice is unavoidable, so this is understood by Weizmann, and we have to decide whether it is better to be unjust to Arabs of Palestine or the Jews who migrated there. And of course, what Weizmann meant was that since the Jews have been dealt horribly by the West, the injustice should fall upon the Palestinian, not upon the Jews. This quote comes from Richard Crossman, who was member of the Anglo-American Commission of Inquiry on Palestine. So we have these two representatives of these two people, Arabs and the Jews, and the two quotes kind of try to capture the essence of the debate that was going on in the UN. Now, going back to the UN, as I said, there is a majority plan, and the majority plan is a partition plan. It calls for the partition of Palestine into two states, one Palestinians, one for the Arabs. It was one of those accidents of history that Israel had the good fortune, the good luck, that the United Nations was really under the West's control, dominated by United States. Remember, United Nations was really created by the United States. And in that sense, America's influence in getting that partition plan accepted, you will see, will prove to be instrumental in getting that. There was also a minority plan, and that minority plan called for a single Palestinian state for both Arab and Jews. So you have a formal governmental structure of a single state, but it's a binational state, Arabs and the Jews. It's noteworthy to realize that this really became Palestinian Liberation Organization, the PLO's plan, a unified binational state. Of course, this wasn't acceptable to the Jews who wanted their own state, and they wanted their own national home based on the Balfour Declaration. To get the majority plan passed in the General Assembly, United States really had to pressure a lot of people and a lot of countries to get that through. In fact, we had to threaten some states that their aids from the United States may get cut. And at the end, the votes really weren't there, and the Arabs didn't even think the vote's going to be there, because this was to them preposterous, taking their land and giving it to someone else, something that even from international law or the perspective of international law, UN was not even authorized to create new countries. 7 countries had abstained on an earlier vote in which the majority plan didn't pass, but because of United States pressure, these 7 countries, which proved to be really the swing countries, they switched from abstaining to an affirmative. These countries were Belgium, France, Haiti, Liberia, Luxembourg, Netherlands, and New Zealand. In the case of Liberia, the Firestone Company put a lot of pressure, telling them that if they don't switch their vote from abstaining to affirmative, they will not get a new factory, the tire factory that they were going to build. So it's that kind of a pressure that led to the creation of the state of Israel. So in sum, United States had to do an incredible amount of arms twisting to get the partition plan passed, and yet everyone knew that this was not a viable plan. Viable in a sense that you're creating a conflict that's going to last and it's not going to get resolved easily. Because when you take someone else's land and give it to someone else, you know you're going to have problems for a very, very long time. So thanks to the United States pressure, the majority plan under Resolution 181 receives the necessary 2/3 vote. And so with that, we have partition plan passed on November 29, 1947. The resolution passes. And you have, based on that resolution, an independent Arab state and independent Jewish state. And as for the Jerusalem is placed really under an international regime, because that was simply too important to the Christians and the Muslim, and not just for the Jews. So Jerusalem, for now at least, is kept separate. And to get an idea how unfair by any standard this majority plan was to the Arabs, you will see from the next slides how the land was divided. Essentially what happens is that Israel ends up getting a much larger land and much better pieces of the land than do the Arab majorities. So if you look at the partition plan, you will see that the Jewish state versus the Arab state has the following characteristic. In terms of area, the Jewish state is larger than the Arab states. In terms of the population that's going to be in each of these states, there are almost 500,000 Jews there versus 10,000 Jews that will remain in the Arab states. Palestinian, some 330,000 Palestinian are going to be in the Jewish state, whereas over 100,000 going to be in the other state. And then there is this 90,000 Bedouins that are really part of the Arab population. They're also going to be in the Jewish state. So you can see that the two plans were very, very unfair to the Arabs. As for the Jerusalem, it's a separate entity. So it's the Corpus Separatum. 67 square miles is designated as a part of that area. The Arab population there will be more than the Jewish by about 5,000. This was based on the census data that we had. And then finally, if you look at the overall kind of summary of this really unfair division of land, you will see that 56% of Palestine is given to the minority Jewish population. In terms of the population of the area, the Jews represent approximately 1/3 of the population of the area, whereas the Palestinians are clearly the majority. Also, the Jews owned only about 8.6% of the land at the time. The Palestinians are 2/3 of the population, about 1,300,000. And then you add to that the Bedouins, the 90,000 Bedouins. So this final map shows the division between the Arabs and Israelis, and as I said, the coastal area by the Mediterranean Sea was given to Israel. So the red area are the land given to Israel, and the yellow area is the land left for the Palestinian. So you get an idea that this is a biased plan, it's an unfair plan, and if you're going to sow the seeds of that kind of a discrimination and this kind of a division in history, you're going to end up paying for it. So I want to next talk about the moment of truth for the Palestinian. As I mentioned, they did not even think this plan would pass. They couldn't believe it would go through, and yet it did. And moreover, once the plan passed, it was not acceptable by them, and they were really stunned with the passage. So after the United Nations vote, the Arabs rejected, as anyone in their position would, and war breaks out in Palestine. People get to Truman telling him that the United States has really acted very irresponsibly in pushing this through. Both the State Department and the Defense Department were dead against the partition plan. And the State Department basically argued, and so did the defense, that you're creating an entity that's going to be deeply problematic, conflictual, and we haven't even thought what our role is going to be in protecting that entity. In fact, the State Department tried pretty hard to change Truman's mind and postpone the vote because of these concerns. They almost succeeded. In February of 1948, Truman almost reversed himself about the implementation of the partition plan. But then again, this did not last very long. His advisor, Clark Clifford, pushed very hard, reminding him that if there is any chance for him to become elected as a president of the United States in 1948 presidential election, he could not afford to lose the vote of New York, state of New York, and New York City, where a huge, relatively speaking, Jewish population resided. So in 1948, we have war breaking out as a result of the partition plan, and we are facing the consequences of the entity that we created in the heart of Middle East. And as you know, from hindsight, this is a problem that's not going to go away, and it's going to give definition to whatever we have learned about the Middle East.